Today, I'd like to talk about some rarely discussed focus secrets, which I use pretty much every time I go out to shoot my nightscape photography. Now, before you get all carried away and think I'm going to be sharing my methods of attaining sharp focus on stars at infinity, well, that's only a small part of our discussion today. Okay, so now that I've got your attention, what do I want to discuss? Very simply, I'm going to run you through my methods and my mindset relating to getting sharp foregrounds in our images. And this is important to me because, as you've often heard me say, the foreground is really the main focus in the majority of my images. And I simply use the Milky Way or the starry night sky as the spectacular canvas upon which to place this foreground. So getting everything in sharp focus at night can be really hard. And a consequence of that is that many times we simply compromise some part of the image in favor of another part. And typically this will be the foreground, as we always want sharp stars in our shots. And this is especially so when shooting single images. So, as I've stated in previous videos, if I'm intending to shoot a single image composition, I'll always ensure that some vital foreground components are not really too close to the camera. Where it gets more complicated is when we want to feature the close foreground subject, and that is what this video is all about. So I want to show you some typical examples of the same scene featuring a fairly close subject of interest in the foreground. And in doing so, I'll show you the reasons behind the focusing techniques I like to use. So to illustrate my point, here is an image of a little car. It's a little bit of light painting. You can see the settings up here. f2.8, 15-second shutter speed, 20mm focal length at ISO 4000. Now, at face value, it looks okay, but if I zoom in on that car, you can clearly see it's out of focus. Now, this image is focused to infinity. Stars are sharp, but the foreground is not sharp, and the reason it's not sharp is because it was too close to the camera. So this was shot, as I said, 20mm focal length. The car was probably about maybe 4 meters away from the camera. Too close. Now, I'm going to show you what happens if I just simply do nothing except change the aperture and the ISO. So let's have a look at this. Here's an image here. Now you can see what I've done here is I've changed to f5.6, ISO 500. So that's why the sky is dark. It's not capturing stars because I've changed those parameters. But I did not touch the focus ring. It is still focused to infinity. Now let's have a look at the front of the car now. Nice and sharp. How about that? Let's have a look at the next picture. Nice and sharp. So you can see that by simply changing the aperture here, the ISO, by the way, has nothing to do with the depth of field. That's simply an exposure parameter. But by changing that aperture here, I have a nice in-focus foreground. And therefore, all I need to do is blend in a sky image such as this with those foreground images, and I have something that looks like this image here, which is beautifully in focus front to back. And all I did was change the aperture to f5.6 in this case for all of those foreground shots. So that is not changing the focus ring at all between any of these exposures. Okay, so here's another one. Let's just look at this full screen just to give you an idea of what it looks like. This is a single exposure image. Now, if you look at these settings, this is shot at f2.2, 15-second shutter speed at ISO 3200, 20mm focal length once again. Now, in this case, the background is nice and sharp because it's focused to infinity. But if I come down on the foreground, you will quickly see that it's well and truly out of focus. And this shot was probably only maybe 3.5 meters away. It was much closer to the camera. And so therefore, the foreground is all out of focus. once again, I want to draw your attention to what this looks like when I stop down the aperture. So here's an image here, f5.6 once again, 10-second shutter speed at ISO 500 and 20mm focal length. I did not refocus onto the foreground, but have a look at that. It's as sharp as anything, simply by changing the aperture. Now, a lot of people look at me and they say, hang on, is that really the way it works? Well, here it is in black and white. I am showing you clearly what happens. And by not changing that focus ring, I am getting really sharp images front to back. And of course, then when I blend those together, we end up with something like this. Now have a look at that. It's beautiful. Sharp as anything, right across the frame. Even the close foreground there is still in focus. And we go into the stars, clouds, Milky Way. It's all there. It is all there and it looks fantastic. Full screen. There's our image. There's no secret to this. It's simply a matter of changing my aperture, not the focus ring. And images that were previously out of focus become in focus. And just one more to prove my point. Now here's another image which was shot at f2.8, 30-second shutter speed, ISO 3200. Now the reason this is shot at 30 seconds is because there were no stars in the sky. It was very moody. There's no editing done on this particular frame. But if I zoom in, you can see that the truck's not in focus. It was still focused to infinity. Now in an image like this, you're starting to get somewhere near focus at the back, but it looks very bad. It's grainy, noisy, quite a bad image. After doing a fair bit of editing and the method I mentioned, changing aperture, I came up with this image. And if you look at this one, it is beautifully sharp and in focus right across the frame. So I just thought it would be good to compare these two images so that you can see them side by side. So let's do that. Now it's probably in some ways not a fair comparison because I've edited one and I haven't really edited the other. But this is all about focus. It's not really about the quality of the image as such. So let's just zoom in and see if we can compare these two. There you go. Now have a look at that. There's so much more clarity on this image on the right, and it's in focus and it's sharp as anything. The reason it is sharp is because I've stopped down the aperture and I've also lowered the ISO, and that is starting to get into the sweet spot of the lens. f5.6, f8 is around about where you want to be with images like this. Now obviously you can't shoot the sky at f5.6 or f8, but you can certainly shoot the foreground, and as you can see from these examples, that foreground is really, really sharp, and that's how come I get these images to look so good. So you can clearly see from these examples that once I've set my focus to infinity, I rarely have to touch the focus ring again. Now, I do want to make it clear that it's always advisable to check and recheck our focus during a night of nightscape shooting, because it's really easy to bump that focus ring, and especially when we move the tripod to a different location and we shuffle around, things like lens warmers, a lot of that stuff can actually set our focus off. I learnt many years ago to never have the attitude that, oh, it'll be right. But what this video is about more so is talking about depth of field, and that's what's achievable at various aperture ranges. Okay, so here we go. We're looking at PhotoPills. Now, this is the mobile app version of PhotoPills. I want you to go down to the one that says depth of field table, the square box there, and click on that. And what you will see here at the top is the camera, the focal length, and the depth of field. Now, what I am looking for here is where is my infinity focus point. So let me set this to, we'll start at f2.8. So you can see there on the top middle left f2.8. And the column on the left hand side shows us the distance in meters, and we will see the infinity symbol come up when it gets to the meter, when it says infinity focus. And there it is. According to what PhotoPill's depth of field table is telling us, at 5 meters at f2.8 on a Nikon Z6 Mark II camera at 20mm focal length, we have infinity focus. So basically what that means is if I focus to infinity at f2.8, I can't have anything closer than 5 meters in my foreground, otherwise it will be out of focus. Now, in reality, I like to add a little bit to that, so probably 6 meters. But let's see what happens when I go on this line here to f5.6. So let's go to f5.6, and there we have it. Now, f5.6, if we scroll down, you'll notice that infinity symbol comes much closer to 2.5 meters. Okay, so this is telling me exactly what I've been explaining to you. When I change my aperture, my depth of field is increased and my infinity focus point comes much closer to the camera. Now, I'm still focused to infinity, and what that means is everything in the far distance is still in focus, and includes stars, trees, and anything else that's in the distance. But at f5.6, my foreground comes into focus. Now, let's just try this. Let's go to f8 as another example. So here we have f8, and you can see there it comes even closer. It's 2 meters. So we don't have to focus stack in the true sense of the word. All we need to do is change our aperture, and our depth of field increases so much that most of our foreground, if it's beyond 2 or 3 meters, is going to become sharp and in focus. Now, I have showed you many times how I shoot my nightscape photography in the field. But one of the things that you realize upon checking out this PhotoPills chart is that the infinity focus point is far closer than the majority of people expect it to be. And therefore, sometimes you can use a foreground subject that is at an appropriate distance to actually focus on to get your infinity focus. And many times I will use a fence post or a tree or something that's, maybe 10 or 15 meters away. Heaps of times I do this to get accurate focus, because there could be occasions where there's clouds in the sky or the clouds are going to and fro and you can't see any stars to focus. So that is a valid way of getting infinity focus given the table that I've just shown you. Okay, so whenever I discuss this subject with other photographers, I always get that glazed, somewhat starey look from them, and it's as if to say, are you really sure that works? And in fact, I can feel that same stare from many of you watching this video right now. Well, how about we take a look at some more examples? Now, I'm sure a lot of you will be thinking, oh, he's talking about hyperfocal distance here. Well, I have to tell you that is certainly not what I'm talking about here. I'm focusing to infinity and leaving the focus at that spot. All I do after that is change the aperture and increase the depth of field. It's as simple as that. So I'm always still focused to infinity. If I was to use hyperfocal distance focusing system, I would never actually have infinity focus at all. And therefore my stars may well be slightly out of focus. And that's because I'm focusing on the foreground to begin with, not the stars, by using that method. For landscape photography, hyperfocal distance focusing is a very valid system, and in my opinion, not so much for nightscapes. Now, another aspect of not changing the focus when adjusting for foregrounds is the little discussed topic of focus breathing. Many lenses actually slightly change the focal length when adjusting the focus ring, and even prime lenses can do this. So you can imagine that if you want multiple layers to line up when you go to edit in Photoshop, this isn't desirable at all. You'll often end up with a thick black outline around our foreground subject. And of course, this creates another headache that we have to deal with in post-production. Therefore, in theory, if we don't have to change the focus ring, we won't encounter focus breathing. Now, I have a very simple philosophy on these things, and that is, if we can fix a problem in the field whilst shooting an item, then it's what we should do. If I don't have to fix it later on the computer, then I am always a very happy chappy. Okay, so to illustrate my point of focus breathing here, we are focused on the little robot on the bench top, and I'm set at f2.8, 1/25th of a second, ISO 250. Now, as I change the focus, you will see the edge of the frame slightly expand and contract. It's only a slight amount. Now, this is with a Nikon 20mm f1.8 Z lens, which is the one I use more than any other for my Nightscape photography. This can be more pronounced on a little bit longer focal lengths, but it depends on the quality of the lens in some cases. In this example, I changed my aperture to f5.6 and it made no difference. There is still focus breathing. You can see that line moving just the same as it did at f2.8. So focus breathing isn't necessarily dependent on the aperture selected. In this case, I've fitted a Laowa f2 lens and I'm focused onto the robot, and as I move the focus point around, you can see once again there is quite a bit of movement. So this is a much wider angle lens, and yet it still has a reasonable amount of focus breathing. So it seems to apply to various focal length lenses. This time we're shooting with the 35mm f1.8 Nikon lens at f2.8. So we're focused again onto the robot. Let's see what happens. Interesting. This one is far better as far as focus breathing. Not seeing anywhere near as much movement. So that's interesting. The two wider angle lenses that I used exhibited a lot more focus breathing than this 35mm lens. Now, not all lenses will have bad focus breathing characteristics, but if you have one that does, you'll soon grow to hate it. So you can clearly see that the mathematics of focus and lens characteristics have been checked and formulated many years ago by very smart people. But the good thing is that we don't have to work all of this out. All we need to do is follow the well-documented charts and learn the behavior of our particular lenses. Now, it does go without saying that these techniques of focusing, well, they really only work for wide angle lenses. Once we get past about 24mm focal length, it's almost impossible to apply this technique to any close foreground, as the depth of field is just too narrow to drag it into focus. So if we shoot at these longer focal lengths, we'll almost certainly have to use tried and true focus stacking techniques and readjust our focus manually to get everything sharp. Anyway, I hope you find this has been helpful to some of you out there. You know, there's always something new to learn. And in my experience, that's the part of the intrigue of Nightscape shooting that somehow keeps the spark alive. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful week. And as always, I'll be keen to read your comments down below. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.